Good evening, dear listener. Welcome to this quiet corner of the world, where stories unfold like gentle mist across a morning meadow, where mysteries whisper rather than shout, and where the great detective's adventures become pathways into peaceful sleep. Tonight, I invite you to journey with me into a tale of intrigue and wonder, a narrative designed not to startle you awake, but to guide you softly toward dreams. This is a story to slow your thoughts, to calm the racing mind, to create a space where rest can find you naturally. I'm so glad you're here, wherever you might be listening from tonight. Perhaps curled beneath warm blankets as rain taps against your window, or perhaps in a quiet room where the world has finally grown still. Wherever you are welcome here. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The rain had been falling upon London for 3 consecutive days, a steady, persistent whisper against the window panes of 221B Baker Street, creating that particular atmosphere of enclosed comfort that transforms a room into a sanctuary. The fire in the hearth crackled and murmured its ancient song, sending shadows dancing across the walls in hypnotic patterns that seemed almost alive in their gentle movements. I sat in my customary chair, the leather worn smooth by years of contemplative evenings, while across from me, Sherlock Holmes occupied himself with his pipe, the aromatic tobacco smoke curling upward in lazy spirals that caught the lamplight and transformed it into something ethereal, something dreamlike. The clock upon the mantelpiece ticked its measured rhythm, a sound so familiar it had become part of the room's very essence, barely noticed yet profoundly comforting in its constancy. Outside, the gas lamps along Baker Street glowed with their warm amber light, creating halos in the persistent rain, and the occasional hansom cab clattered past, its wheels splashing through puddles, the sound muffled and distant, as though the world beyond our sitting room existed in some other dimension entirely. Holmes had been unusually quiet this evening, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his sharp eyes fixed upon the flames, as though reading messages in their ever-changing forms. The detective's moods were as familiar to me as the rooms we shared, periods of frenetic energy followed by these contemplative silences, moments when his remarkable mind turned inward, processing the countless observations and deductions that made him London's most singular consulting detective. Mrs. Hudson had brought us tea an hour earlier, the delicate china cups still resting upon the side table, the amber liquid having cooled to lukewarm, forgotten in the comfortable silence that had settled over us like a soft blanket. The scent of Earl Grey mingled with the tobacco smoke and the faint mustiness of old books that lined our walls, creating an olfactory signature as distinctive as a fingerprint, the very smell of home and safety and intellectual companionship. "Watson," Holmes murmured at last, his voice barely rising above the whisper of rain and crackle of fire. "Do you believe in fate?" The question hung in the air between us, unexpected and philosophical, quite different from his usual precise inquiries about observation and deduction. I shifted in my chair, the leather creaking softly beneath me, and considered my response carefully, knowing that Holmes, despite his protestations of pure logic, sometimes sought these deeper conversations in his quieter moments. "I believe," I began slowly, choosing my words with care, "that life presents us with patterns we cannot always comprehend in the moment, but which reveal their purpose in retrospect." Holmes nodded almost imperceptibly, his eyes still fixed upon the flames. "An elegant evasion, my dear fellow, but tonight I find myself contemplating such questions with unusual frequency. He paused, drawing upon his pipe, the ember glowing briefly in the dim room. I received a letter this morning, delivered before you had risen, and it speaks to matters that seem to reach beyond the ordinary realm of criminal investigation into something altogether more mysterious. He reached into his dressing gown pocket and withdrew an envelope of heavy cream-coloured paper, the kind used by families of considerable means and longer pedigree. The wax seal had been broken, but I could see it bore an elaborate crest I did not immediately recognise. 3 ravens arranged in a circular pattern surrounding what appeared to be a star or compass rose. The letter comes from Northumberland, Holmes continued, his voice maintaining that same quiet, measured tone that seemed so appropriate to the evening's contemplative atmosphere. From a Lady Catherine Ashworth, whose family has resided at Ashworth Hall for some 6 centuries, through wars and plagues and the rise and fall of dynasties. She writes regarding a tragedy that occurred precisely 1 year ago, a death that was ruled accidental by the local authorities, but which she believes harbours darker elements. The fire shifted suddenly, a log settling deeper into the grate with a soft, crumbling sound, sending a small shower of sparks upward into the chimney. The shadows on the walls reorganized themselves into new configurations, and I found myself leaning forward slightly, drawn into the beginnings of what promised to be a tale of considerable interest. The deceased was her younger brother, Edmund Ashworth, Holmes explained, his voice taking on that particular quality it assumed when he was reciting facts from memory, each detail preserved with perfect clarity. A young man of 26 years, by all accounts good-natured and well-liked, with no enemies and no apparent reason to die. Yet, on the night of December 15th, during the first hard freeze of winter, he was found dead upon the surface of the lake that borders the Ashworth estate, frozen into the ice in a position Lady Catherine describes as peculiar, his arms outstretched as though reaching for something, his face turned toward the shore, his expression one of what witnesses called serene acceptance. Outside, the rain intensified slightly, drumming a more insistent rhythm against the windows. Yet, rather than creating anxiety, the sound seemed to deepen the sense of shelter within our rooms, making the story Holmes told feel both immediate and safely distant, a tale we could explore without danger from our comfortable positions by the fire. The local physician concluded that Edmund had ventured onto the ice despite warnings about its thickness, had fallen through, and had died of exposure combined with drowning, managing to pull himself partially back onto the surface before succumbing to the cold. Holmes continued, his fingers absently turning the letter over and over. A tragic accident, certainly, but not unprecedented in the harsh northern winters. The matter would have ended there, marked as a cautionary tale about the dangers of overconfidence and nature's indifference to human frailty. He paused, and I heard him take a slow sip from his teacup, though the liquid must have been quite cold by now. The domestic sound created a small punctuation in his narrative, a moment to absorb what had been said before proceeding deeper into the mystery. However, Holmes resumed, Lady Catherine includes certain details in her letter that the official investigation seems to have overlooked or dismissed. She writes that her brother had been behaving strangely in the weeks before his death, waking in the night and walking through the halls, speaking of dreams that seemed to trouble him deeply, becoming increasingly withdrawn from family and friends. She mentions that he had begun spending hours in the estate's old library, researching the property's history with an intensity that seemed almost obsessive. The detective finally turned his gaze from the fire to meet my eyes directly, and I saw in his expression that mixture of skepticism and curiosity that appeared whenever a case presented elements that defied easy rational explanation. Most intriguingly, she notes that on the night of his death, Edmund left a single piece of paper in his room, upon which he had written a sequence of dates and numbers that mean nothing to her, but which she has transcribed in a letter to me. She also mentions that other members of the household staff have reported strange occurrences since Edmund's death, sounds emanating from the frozen lake at night, the appearance of lights moving beneath the ice, and the persistent feeling of being watched when approaching the water's edge. I felt a small shiver run through me, though whether from the content of the tale or simply the atmospheric conditions of our rain-soaked evening, I could not say. Sounds like local superstition taking root in the wake of tragedy, I ventured, playing my customary role of rational skeptic to Holmes's more complex methodology. Perhaps, Holmes agreed, his tone suggesting he had not yet formed a definitive opinion. Or perhaps something more interesting lies beneath the surface, both literally and figuratively. Lady Catherine has invited us to Ashworth Hall, offering generous compensation for our time and travel, though she emphasizes that her primary motivation is not monetary, but rather a need to understand what truly happened to her brother. She writes that the anniversary of his death approaches rapidly, and she wishes to mark it either with closure or with genuine understanding, rather than the false comfort of official explanations that fail to account for all the evidence. The clock chimed the half-hour, its gentle tones reverberating through the room, before fading back into the comfortable silence. Holmes rose from his chair with that particular grace he possessed, moving to the window where he stood, looking out at the rain-washed street, his silhouette dark against the amber glow of the gas lamps beyond. "I have already sent a telegram accepting the invitation," he said quietly. "We depart tomorrow on the morning train to Newcastle, from whence a private carriage will convey us to Ashworth Hall. I trust this does not conflict with your schedule, Watson. I find myself unable to resist the combination of historical estate, mysterious death, and the suggestion of phenomena that exist at the boundary between the explicable and the inexplicable." I smiled, already mentally preparing for the journey ahead, already anticipating the familiar rhythms of investigation and discovery that attending Holmes's cases had become central to my existence. "My schedule, as you well know, remains perpetually flexible in service of your investigations," I replied warmly. "I would not miss this for any engagement London might offer." Holmes turned from the window, and in the firelight I saw him smile, a rare expression of genuine pleasure that transformed his usually austere features into something almost boyish. "Excellent, my dear Watson. Pack warmly. Northumberland in December will test even your military constitution. And bring your revolver, though I anticipate we shall be combating mysteries rather than malefactors on this particular journey." The fire crackled again, sending another shower of golden sparks upward, and Holmes returned to his chair, reaching for the abandoned teacup. He made a small sound of mild disappointment upon discovering its cold state, then set it down with a gentle clink of china on saucer. The small domestic moment, so human and ordinary, provided a perfect counterpoint to the extraordinary tale that had unfolded in his telling. "Tell me, Holmes," I asked after a moment, "what do you make of the details Lady Catherine mentioned regarding strange occurrences since her brother's death? Surely you don't put credence in ghost stories and supernatural phenomena?" Holmes's eyes glittered with that sharp intelligence that never truly dimmed, even in his most relaxed moments. "I put credence in observation, Watson, and in the fact that human beings are remarkably consistent in their inconsistencies. When multiple witnesses report similar phenomena, we must ask not whether the phenomena are real in some absolute sense, but rather what circumstances are producing such consistent reports. Lights beneath ice might be reflections, refraction effects, or even bioluminescent phenomena. There are documented cases of certain organisms creating illumination in frozen water. Sounds might be the ice itself, which expands and contracts with temperature changes, producing remarkable acoustic effects. As for the feeling of being watched..." He trailed off, his expression becoming thoughtful. "Human perception is a fascinating instrument, Watson. We sense more than we consciously recognize, and what we dismiss as feelings or intuition may, in fact, be our minds processing subliminal observations. A pattern of footprints in frost, the scent of another person carried on the wind, the subtle displacement of natural sounds that suggests a presence. I remain skeptical of ghosts, but endlessly fascinated by the human mind's capacity to construct them from perfectly natural phenomena it cannot fully articulate." The rain continued its steady whisper against the windows, and I felt my eyes growing pleasantly heavy, the warmth of the fire and the cadence of Holmes's voice combining to create that particular state of relaxed attention that precedes sleep. Yet I wanted to hear more, to understand more about this case that seemed to combine so many elements: tragedy and mystery, history and the present moment, the rational and the inexplicable. "Tell me about Ashworth Hall," I requested, settling deeper into my chair. "What do you know of the family and their estate?" Holmes refreshed his pipe with practiced efficiency, the small ritual of tamping tobacco and striking the match, creating another moment of domestic tranquility, before he began speaking again in that measured, soothing tone. "The Ashworth family," he began, "represents a particularly interesting lineage in English history. Unlike many noble houses whose fortunes rose and fell with political winds, the Ashworths maintained their position through a combination of strategic marriages, careful stewardship of their lands, and a notable tendency to avoid taking strong positions in the various conflicts that tore England apart over the centuries. They were neither fervent royalists nor passionate parliamentarians during the Civil War, neither Catholics nor extreme Protestants during the Reformation. This strategic ambiguity allowed them to survive where more passionate houses perished. The fire popped softly, and Holmes paused to sip from his pipe before continuing. Ashworth Hall itself dates to the late 14th century, though it has been considerably modified and expanded over the generations. It sits upon land that was significantly older in terms of human habitation. There are records suggesting a Roman structure once occupied the site, and local folklore places a druidic stone circle somewhere on the extensive grounds, though no one has definitively located it in modern times. I felt myself drifting, not into sleep, but into that pleasant state where narrative and imagination merge, where I could almost see the ancient hall rising from the Northumberland landscape, its stone walls weathered by centuries of harsh northern weather, its windows glowing with warm light against the gathering darkness. The lake that features so prominently in our case, Holmes continued, his voice taking on an almost lyrical quality, is called Mere's End, and it has its own rather melancholy history. It's a natural body of water, spring-fed, and quite deep in its centre. Local estimates suggest upward of 80 feet at its deepest point. The name Mere's End supposedly derives from a corruption of Mary's End, referring to a young woman who drowned there in medieval times, under circumstances that were never entirely clear. Over the centuries, the lake has claimed several lives, as bodies of water often do in regions where winters are harsh and ice thickness can be deceptive. Outside, I heard a carriage pass, its wheels splashing through puddles, the sound of hoofbeats muffled by the rain, and the distant call of the driver to his horse, all creating a sense of London continuing its life beyond our warm sanctuary, while we contemplated mysteries in far northern reaches of England. Edmund Ashworth, Holmes said, his voice dropping to an even quieter register, was by all accounts a young man of scholarly inclinations, having studied history and classics at Cambridge, though he never pursued a formal career, being financially independent through family wealth. Lady Catherine writes that he was particularly interested in local history and folklore, and that he had spoken occasionally of writing a comprehensive history of the estate and surrounding region, though he had never undertaken the project seriously until the weeks before his death, when it seemed to become an overwhelming preoccupation. The detective paused, and I could sense him arranging the facts in his mind, building the architecture of understanding that preceded his more dramatic insights. The sequence of dates and numbers she transcribed from his final note reads 1347, 1215, 1547, 1215, 1747, 1215, 1847, 1215, 1947, 1215. You will notice, Watson, that all dates fall precisely on December 15th, and that they occur at exact 100-year intervals. I opened my eyes more fully, the pattern piercing through my growing drowsiness. And Edmund died on December 15th as well. Precisely, Holmes confirmed. December 15th of last year, which would be 1947 if we extend his sequence, though the notes were found in a state suggesting they were written some days before his death, meaning he had calculated or discovered this pattern before the actual date arrived. The implications stirred in my mind like leaves in wind, suggesting connections I could not quite grasp. You believe he discovered something about these dates, some recurring event or pattern in the estate's history? I believe, Holmes replied carefully, that young Edmund discovered or believed he had discovered something significant, and that this discovery may have led him to the lake on that particular night, though whether it also led to his death remains to be determined. The coincidence of dates is certainly remarkable, though we must be cautious about assigning meaning to patterns before we understand their origin. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures, Watson, and we often find significance in random arrangements, simply because our minds are constructed to do so. He set his pipe aside and stood again, moving to the bookshelf, where he withdrew a thick, leather-bound volume I recognized as his commonplace book of unusual cases and historical curiosities. He leafed through it slowly, his long fingers turning pages with the delicacy of a scholar handling ancient manuscripts. "I have here a note," he murmured, more to himself than to me, regarding Ashworth Hall that I recorded some years ago after reading an obscure historical journal. "Ah, yes, here it is. In 1747, a servant at Ashworth Hall reported seeing strange lights upon the frozen mere on December 15th, and claimed that a member of the family nearly drowned after venturing onto the ice that night, though he was saved by companions. The incident was dismissed as winter folly, encouraged by consumption of Christmas spirits, and no significance was attached to it. Holmes looked up from the book, his eyes meeting mine with that expression of intense concentration that signified his mind was racing through possibilities and connections at remarkable speed. So, we have at least two of the dates from Edmund's list, 1747 and potentially 1947, associated with incidents on or near the frozen lake. This suggests he had indeed uncovered a genuine pattern of some kind, though what might cause such a century-spanning phenomenon remains entirely mysterious. The clock ticked steadily onward, and I realized that nearly an hour had passed since Holmes first mentioned Lady Catherine's letter, the time flowing like water, unmarked and gentle. The rain had softened again to its earlier whisper, and the fire had burned down to a bed of glowing coals that pulsed with warmth and light, creating an atmosphere of such profound comfort that the mysterious deaths and frozen lakes seemed like elements from a fairy tale, rather than actual events demanding investigation. "We should retire soon," Holmes suggested, though without any particular urgency. "Tomorrow's journey will be lengthy, and I wish to arrive at Ashworth Hall with fresh eyes and an alert mind. The train departs at 9 o'clock, which means we must breakfast early and arrange for a hansom no later than 8. I nodded, though I made no immediate move to rise, and Holmes seemed content to remain a few moments longer in the comfortable silence of our sitting room. There was something almost ceremonial about these last quiet hours before beginning an investigation, a moment of calm before entering the storm of questions and observations that would consume our attention once we arrived at the scene of the mystery. "Holmes," I ventured after a moment, "do you ever feel that some cases call to you in ways that transcend the purely intellectual challenge?" The detective tilted his head slightly, considering the question with the seriousness he accorded to all thoughtful inquiries, even those that touched on matters of emotion and intuition he often claimed to eschew. "I find," he said slowly, "that certain cases resonate with aspects of the human experience that extend beyond crime and deduction. This case speaks to the persistence of the past, to the way history echoes through generations, to the mystery of patterns that seem too precise to be coincidental, yet too strange to be easily explained. Yes, Watson, I feel called to this case, though I would struggle to articulate precisely why in terms that would satisfy my usual standards of logical discourse." A soft knock at the door interrupted our conversation, and Mrs. Hudson appeared with a tray bearing fresh tea, her kindly face showing no surprise at finding us still awake despite the late hour. She had long since become accustomed to our irregular schedule, our tendency to remain deep in conversation, well past the hour when respectable London slept. "I thought you gentlemen might like something warm before retiring," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone of affectionate exasperation she reserved for her lodgers, treating us like brilliant but occasionally impractical children who needed looking after. "And I've taken the liberty of preparing your travelling cases for the morning, Mr. Holmes. You'll want warm clothes for Northumberland this time of year. I've included extra scarves and your heavy greatcoats." "Mrs. Hudson," Holmes said with genuine warmth, "you are a marvel of efficiency and foresight Watson and I would be quite lost without your ministrations." She made a small, pleased sound and set the tea tray on the table between our chairs, the cups steaming gently, the scent of fresh Earl Grey filling the room with its distinctive bergamot perfume. The small silver pot gleamed in the firelight, and there was a plate of biscuits as well, though neither Holmes nor I possessed much appetite so late in the evening. "Will you be gone long?" Mrs. Hudson inquired, straightening the tray with the unconscious precision of someone who had performed such tasks countless times. "Difficult to say," Holmes replied. "Perhaps a week, perhaps longer, depending on what we discover. But I trust you'll maintain our rooms in your usual impeccable fashion during our absence." "As if you needed to ask," she responded with a small smile, and then she departed, closing the door with a soft click that seemed to restore the quiet intimacy of our space. Holmes poured tea for both of us, the amber liquid flowing from spout to cup with a gentle splashing sound that was deeply soothing in its ordinariness. He added a small amount of milk to his cup and handed me mine without sugar, knowing my preferences as well as I knew his after our years of shared lodgings and adventures. The tea was hot and perfect, and I held the cup between my palms, feeling its warmth seep into my hands, the sensation grounding and comforting. Outside, the rain continued its endless whisper, and London settled deeper into its night rhythms. Distant sounds of late carriages, the call of a constable on his rounds, the city's heartbeat slowing but never quite stopping. "I wonder," I mused aloud, "what we shall find at Ashworth Hall. Do you truly believe there is a genuine mystery here? Or will we discover that grief has led Lady Catherine to see significance where none exists?" Holmes took a slow sip of his tea before responding, his expression thoughtful. "I believe we will find a complex truth that contains elements of both, Watson. There is almost certainly a genuine pattern of some kind. Those dates are too precise, too consistent to be entirely coincidental. But whether that pattern represents something supernatural, something criminal, or merely something unusual that has been misinterpreted through the lens of tragedy and folklore, that remains to be determined." He paused, turning his cup slowly in his hands, watching the firelight reflect on its surface. "Human beings create meaning, Watson. We are storytelling creatures who cannot bear to live in a universe devoid of pattern and significance. When a young man dies mysteriously on a date that seems to connect to similar mysterious events across centuries, the mind naturally constructs narratives to explain the connection. Our task will be to separate the objective facts from the narrative superstructure that has been built around them, to find the truth beneath the story, as it were." I found myself nodding, though my eyes were growing heavy again, the late hour and the warmth and the gentle rhythm of Holmes's voice all conspiring to guide me toward sleep. "You make it sound like an archaeological expedition," I murmured, "excavating truth from layers of interpretation." "An apt metaphor," Holmes agreed, "and like archaeology, the work requires patience, careful attention to context, and a willingness to revise one's theories as new evidence emerges. I confess I am quite looking forward to spending time in Ashworth's library, examining whatever historical documents and records the family has maintained. The answers to Edmund's death almost certainly lie somewhere in the estate's past, waiting to be uncovered by someone with the knowledge to recognize their significance." The fire had burned very low now, just a bed of coals radiating gentle heat, and the room had taken on that particular quality of deep night, when the world seems to pause, when even time itself appears to slow. The rain had softened to the merest whisper, and through the window I could see that the gas lamps were dimming as their fuel ran low, awaiting the lamplighter's morning rounds. "We should retire," Holmes said again, this time with more finality. "Tomorrow begins early, and we have a long journey ahead." I roused myself from the comfortable depths of my chair, feeling the pleasant stiffness that comes from sitting too long in one position, my muscles reminding me of their existence as I stood. Holmes remained seated a moment longer, his eyes once more fixed on the dying fire, his mind clearly still engaged with the mystery that awaited us in Northumberland. "Holmes," I said softly, "whatever we find at Ashworth Hall, I'm glad to be accompanying you. These investigations, these journeys into the unknown, they remain the most vital and meaningful experiences of my life." The detective looked up at me, and in the dim light I saw something in his expression that might have been affection, though he would never use such a word. "As they are for me, my dear Watson, as they are for me." I retired to my room, leaving Holmes still seated by the embers, and as I prepared for sleep, I found my mind wandering ahead to the journey we would undertake tomorrow, the train carrying us northward through the English countryside, the landscape gradually shifting from the soft hills of the Midlands to the harsher, more dramatic terrain of the north, and finally to Ashworth Hall itself, ancient and mysterious, holding within its walls the secrets of young Edmund's death, and perhaps the secrets of centuries before. Sleep found me eventually, as it always did, and my dreams were filled with frozen lakes and ancient halls, with patterns that repeated across time like ripples spreading from a stone dropped into still water, with mysteries that whispered rather than shouted, drawing me deeper into their embrace, even as consciousness receded into the gentle darkness of night. Morning arrived with the particular grey pearl quality that characterizes December days in London, the rain having finally ceased, but leaving behind a world washed clean and gleaming with moisture. I woke to the sound of Mrs. Hudson moving about downstairs, preparing breakfast, and the faint rumble of early morning traffic beginning to flow through Baker Street, delivery carts and early omnibuses, the city rousing itself to face another day. I dressed quickly in the warm travelling clothes Mrs. Hudson had laid out, appreciating her foresight as I donned the heavy wool trousers and thick socks that would serve me well in Northumberland's harsher climate. By the time I descended to our sitting room, I found Holmes already awake and impeccably dressed, standing by the window with a cup of coffee in hand, observing the street below with that perpetual alertness that characterized his nature. "Good morning, Watson," he greeted me warmly. "I trust you slept well. You'll be pleased to know that Mrs. Hudson has prepared a substantial breakfast: eggs, bacon, toast, and her excellent marmalade. We should eat heartily. I cannot predict when we'll next enjoy a proper meal, and train dining cars, while adequate, rarely match Mrs. Hudson's standard of cooking." The breakfast table had indeed been set with considerable care, and we ate in companionable silence, the morning light gradually strengthening beyond the windows as the city continued its awakening. There was something ceremonial about this meal, a last moment of domestic normalcy before launching ourselves into the unknown. The hansom cab arrived precisely at 8 o'clock, and Holmes and I descended to the street with our travelling cases, which Mrs. Hudson had indeed packed with remarkable thoroughness. I glimpsed not only clothing, but several books, writing materials, and Holmes's portable laboratory equipment, carefully wrapped in cloth to prevent damage during travel. "Take care of yourselves," Mrs. Hudson admonished from the doorway, her breath visible in the cold air. "And do send word if you'll be delayed beyond a week. I like to know when to expect you back." "We shall keep you informed," Holmes assured her. And then we were climbing into the cab, and the driver was urging his horse forward, and Baker Street was falling away behind us as we made our way through the London morning toward King's Cross Station. The journey through London's streets provided that peculiar mixture of familiarity and novelty that characterizes urban travel. The same basic routes and landmarks, but always with small variations in detail. New shop fronts, different pedestrians, the city as both constant and ever-changing. We passed through neighborhoods awakening to their daily rhythms, shopkeepers opening their establishments, workers hurrying toward their employment, street vendors setting up their carts and beginning their characteristic calls advertising wares. Holmes spent the journey gazing out the window, occasionally making small observations about the people we passed, reading their lives from the cut of their clothes and the manner of their walking, that remarkable skill of his that transformed the ordinary into the revealing. "That gentleman there," he murmured at one point, gesturing toward a man in a threadbare coat, "recently returned from sea, based on his rolling gait and the particular weathering of his face. Note how the tan extends only to his collar line, suggesting exposure while wearing maritime clothing. And the woman crossing the street has just come from a bakery, obviously. You can see the flour dust still clinging to her right sleeve, where she carried a large order against her side." These small observations served as mental exercises, keeping his faculties sharp, warming up the remarkable engine of his intellect, before applying it to the more substantial mystery awaiting us in Northumberland. I listened with the pleasure I always felt when witnessing Holmes's unique gifts, never tiring of seeing the invisible made visible through his particular form of genius. King's Cross Station greeted us with its characteristic bustle and energy, even at this relatively early hour. The great arched shed echoed with the sounds of arriving and departing trains, the hiss of steam, the calls of porters and vendors, the complex symphony of travel and commerce and human movement, the smell of coal smoke and machinery mingled with coffee and pastries from the station's cafes, creating that distinctive railway station atmosphere that speaks simultaneously of departure and possibility. We made our way through the crowds to the platform where the northbound express was already waiting, its dark green carriages gleaming with recent polish, steam rising lazily from its stack, the massive locomotive radiating power barely contained. A porter took our cases and led us to a first-class compartment Holmes had reserved, a private space furnished with comfortable seating, upholstered in dark blue fabric, with a small table beneath the window and brass fittings that gleamed with careful maintenance. We should reach Newcastle by mid-afternoon, Holmes informed me as we settled into our seats, and the porter stowed our luggage. Lady Catherine's representative will meet us there with a private carriage for the final leg of our journey to Ashworth Hall, which lies some 20 miles west of Newcastle, deeper into the Northumberland countryside. The platform clock showed 10 minutes until departure, and we occupied this brief interval watching the final preparations. Passengers hurrying to their carriages, last pieces of luggage being loaded, guards checking doors and signalling readiness. There is something deeply satisfying about train travel, I have always felt, something that appeals to the human love of both movement and comfort, the pleasure of watching the world pass while remaining in a secure, defined space. A whistle blew, clear and piercing, and the train lurched gently into motion, the platform beginning to slide past our window as the locomotive gradually gathered momentum. We moved slowly through the station's covered area, then emerged into the grey morning light, the city spreading around us as we began our northward journey. For the first hour, we travelled through London's northern suburbs and outskirts, watching the urban landscape gradually thin and soften, the closely packed buildings giving way to more open spaces, industrial areas yielding to market gardens, and finally to proper countryside. Holmes occupied himself with reading the morning papers he had purchased at the station, occasionally commenting on items of interest. A burglary in Kensington, a political scandal involving a minor minister, the discovery of Roman artifacts during excavation for a new underground line. I found myself content to watch the landscape flowing past, the gentle rocking of the carriage, and the rhythmic sound of wheels on rails, creating a hypnotic effect that was deeply peaceful. The countryside wore its winter colours, the browns and greys of dormant vegetation, the darker green of evergreens, the occasional stark beauty of a leafless tree silhouetted against the pale sky. Now and then we passed through small villages, their church spires marking their centres, smoke rising from chimneys, signs of human life nested within the larger landscape. A steward came through offering tea and refreshments, and we accepted gratefully the hot liquid welcome on this cold journey. Holmes set aside his newspapers, and we sat in comfortable silence, sipping our tea and watching England unfold beyond our window. "Tell me more about Lady Catherine," I requested after a while. "What manner of person do you expect her to be?" Holmes considered the question, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest in a characteristic gesture. Her letter suggests intelligence and careful observation. She includes details that many would overlook, and she makes no wild claims of definitively supernatural events, merely reports phenomena that others have described to her. She expresses appropriate grief over her brother's death, but does not seem paralyzed by it. She seeks understanding rather than merely seeking to assign blame or find comfort in convenient explanations. He paused to sip his tea before continuing. She is 32 years of age, unmarried, which is somewhat unusual for a woman of her class, and means, suggesting either particular circumstances or a degree of independence that resists conventional expectations. She manages the estate now, her father having died several years ago, and Edmund having been the only brother. There is, I believe, another sister, younger, but Lady Catherine is clearly the family's current head in all but formal title. The train swayed gently as we rounded a curve, and through the window I caught a glimpse of a river winding through winter fields, its surface reflecting the grey sky like polished steel. A heron stood motionless at its edge, and then the view was gone, replaced by a line of hedgerows, and beyond them, rolling hills climbing toward an invisible horizon. The estate must be considerable if it has supported the family for 6 centuries, I observed. Indeed, Holmes agreed. Several thousand acres, I believe, including productive farmland, woodland, and the lake that concerns our investigation. The family's wealth derives primarily from traditional agricultural rents, though they have also been wise enough to invest in more modern ventures. There are shares in railway companies and manufacturing concerns that have provided additional income as older forms of wealth have become less reliable. He set down his teacup and turned his attention more fully toward me. What strikes me as most interesting about this case, Watson, is the timescale it potentially encompasses. If Edmund truly did discover a pattern of events recurring at century intervals, we are dealing with something that stretches far beyond the scope of individual human lives. Most crimes I investigate occur within the narrow compass of months or years, motives and opportunities arising from recent events and immediate circumstances. But this suggests something else entirely, a pattern that long requires either extraordinary coincidence or some mechanism of perpetuation that transcends individual agency. I felt a small shiver at his words, though the compartment was warm enough. You suggest some kind of organized effort spanning generations, a secret society or cult maintaining some ritual or tradition. That is certainly one possibility, Holmes acknowledged, though I try not to form firm hypotheses before examining the evidence directly. Still, it's difficult not to speculate. What could cause such a precise pattern? What knowledge might be passed down through centuries? What purpose might motivate such long-term planning? These are fascinating questions, Watson, and I confess myself thoroughly intrigued. The train rumbled onward, carrying us steadily northward through the English countryside, and the miles accumulated beneath us like pages turning in a book, each bringing us closer to Ashworth Hall and the mysteries it contained. Holmes eventually returned to his newspapers, though I noticed his attention was less focused than before, his mind clearly working on the problem that awaited us. Midday came, and we made our way to the dining car for luncheon, finding it perhaps 2/3 full with other first-class passengers. The meal was adequate, if not inspired. Soup, roasted chicken, vegetables, a modest wine to accompany it all. We ate while watching the landscape continue its slow transformation. The gentle hills of the Midlands giving way to more dramatic terrain as we pushed further north. Returning to our compartment afterward, I found my eyes growing heavy, the morning's early rising and the rhythmic motion of the train conspiring to make sleep appealing. Holmes, noticing my drowsiness, smiled slightly. "Rest if you wish, Watson. We have several hours yet, and I prefer you arrive at Ashworth Hall refreshed, rather than exhausted." I needed little encouragement, arranging myself comfortably in my seat, and allowing the train's gentle rocking to carry me into sleep. My dreams were fragmentary and strange, frozen lakes that became mirrors reflecting not the sky, but other times, other faces, ancient halls whose corridors extended into infinity, and always a sense of something just beyond perception, some pattern or truth that remained tantalizingly out of reach. I woke some hours later to find the landscape transformed. We were now in proper northern country, the hills more rugged, the stone of buildings changing from brick and soft southern stone to the harder, greyer stone of the north. The sky had darkened with the early onset of December twilight, and already lights were appearing in the scattered farmhouses we passed. "We're approaching Newcastle," Holmes informed me. "Another 20 minutes at most." True to his estimate, we soon found ourselves slowing as the city came into view. The Tyne River winding through it, the famous bridges spanning its width, the castle that gave the city its name perched on its cliff overlooking the water. As the light faded, the city's lamps were being lit, creating constellations of light that mirrored the stars just beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The train pulled into Newcastle Central Station with a long hiss of steam and the squeal of brakes, and we gathered our belongings, stepping down onto the platform into air that was noticeably colder than London's, carrying a sharp edge that spoke of northern winters and proximity to harsh landscapes. A man approached us almost immediately, tall, weathered, with the bearing of someone accustomed to outdoor life and the direct manner of northern folk. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I'm Thomas Brennan, head groom at Ashworth Hall. Lady Catherine sent me to fetch you, gentlemen." Holmes shook his hand firmly. "Mr. Brennan, excellent timing. May I present Dr. John Watson, my colleague and friend. We're grateful for the prompt arrangement." Brennan nodded to me respectfully, then gestured toward the station's exit. "I've the carriage waiting just outside, and the horses are fresh. It'll be near dark by the time we reach the hall, but the roads are good enough, and I know them well, even in poor light. Lady Catherine asks that I extend her apologies for not greeting you herself. She's been detained with estate business, but looks forward to meeting you at dinner." He led us through the station and out into the evening air, where a substantial carriage awaited, drawn by two handsome horses that stamped and blew clouds of breath into the cold air. A young lad held their heads, and Brennan pressed a coin into his hand before helping us into the carriage and securing our luggage. "It's about 2 hours' drive," Brennan called down to us as he took his seat and gathered the reins. "There's blankets there beside you. You'll want them before long. We're heading into the hills, and it gets colder as we go." The carriage lurched into motion, and we pulled away from the station, navigating through Newcastle's evening streets before finding our way to the Western Road. Gradually, the city fell away behind us, and we entered countryside that even in the gathering darkness showed itself to be more dramatic than anything we had passed through during our train journey. Steeper hills, rockier ground, a landscape shaped by harder forces than the gentle south. Holmes and I wrapped ourselves in the provided blankets, grateful for their warmth as the temperature continued to drop. Above us, stars appeared in increasing numbers as we left behind the city's lights, the winter sky revealing itself in all its cold, distant majesty. The moon was nearly full, rising in the east and casting silver light across the landscape, transforming it into something almost otherworldly in its stark beauty. The carriage rocked and swayed as we climbed and descended hills, following roads that wound through this ancient landscape. Occasionally, we passed through small villages, just a handful of cottages clustered around a crossroads or a church, warm light showing in windows, smoke rising from chimneys. But mostly, we travelled through open country, the hills rolling away on either side, dotted with the darker shapes of stands of trees, the landscape speaking of an older, harsher England than the comfortable modernised south. "We're on Ashworth land now," Brennan called back to us after perhaps an hour and a half had passed. Another 20 minutes to the hall itself. The landscape had changed again. We were following a valley now, with a small river or large stream running alongside the road, its surface catching the moonlight and returning it in gleaming fragments. Trees grew more thickly here, creating corridors of shadow through which we passed, the horses' hoofbeats echoing off close stone walls. And then, rounding a curve, we caught our first glimpse of Ashworth Hall. It rose from the landscape like something grown from the stone itself, massive and ancient, its architecture speaking of centuries of additions and modifications, while maintaining an essential unity of purpose and presence. The central structure appeared to be the oldest, a tower-like keep of unmistakable medieval origin, its crenellations sharp against the stars. Extending from this core were later additions, Tudor and Jacobean wings, Georgian improvements, each era leaving its mark while respecting what had come before. Lights glowed in many of its windows, warm and welcoming after our long journey, and as we drew closer, I could make out more details: the great arched entrance, the mullioned windows, the weathered stone that spoke of 6 centuries of wind and rain and sun and frost. The hall sat at the bottom of a shallow valley, protected from the worst weather, with higher ground rising behind it and to the sides. And there, just visible in the moonlight, extending beyond the hall's southern aspect, was the lake, Mere's End, its surface a perfect mirror reflecting moon and stars, its edges distinct against the darker ground surrounding it. Even from this distance, even knowing nothing yet of the mysteries it held, the lake possessed an undeniable presence, a quality of watching and waiting that made me understand viscerally why it featured so prominently in local folklore and family tragedy. The carriage followed the drive up to the hall's main entrance, gravel crunching beneath the wheels, and as we drew to a halt, the great door opened and a figure appeared, a woman silhouetted against the light from within, waiting to receive us. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she called out, as Brennan helped us down from the carriage. "Welcome to Ashworth Hall. I am Catherine Ashworth, and I cannot adequately express my gratitude for your willingness to travel so far on my behalf." She stepped forward into the light spilling from the doorway, and I received my first clear impression of our hostess. She was tall, nearly matching my own height, with the erect bearing of someone accustomed to authority and responsibility. Her face, though marked by the passage of 32 years, and undoubtedly by grief, possessed a classical beauty, enhanced rather than diminished by the intelligence that animated her features. Her hair was dark, drawn back in a practical style, and her eyes, grey or perhaps blue in this light, regarded us with an intensity that reminded me somewhat of Holmes himself, that quality of acute observation and analysis. She wore morning clothes still, a black dress of fine but practical fabric, appropriate for someone who managed an estate rather than merely presided over social functions. No jewellery adorned her, save for a single ring on her right hand, bearing what I took to be the Ashworth crest, the 3 ravens and compass rose I had glimpsed on the letter's seal. "Lady Catherine," Holmes responded, taking her extended hand with courtly grace, "the gratitude is mutual. Your letter presented a most intriguing puzzle, and Dr. Watson and I are both honoured to offer what assistance we may in resolving it." She turned to me, and I bowed slightly over her hand, noting the strength of her grip, the slight calluses that spoke of someone who engaged in practical work rather than merely decorative activity. "Dr. Watson, your chronicles of Mr. Holmes's cases have been a source of considerable entertainment and admiration in this household. I confess, I read them with perhaps more than casual interest, given my own family's involvement with events that defy easy explanation." "You are too kind," I murmured, though I felt the familiar pleasure her words brought. I have never tired of hearing that my poor attempts at capturing Holmes's genius have found appreciative audiences. "Please, come inside," Lady Catherine urged, stepping back to allow us entry. "You must be chilled after your journey, and dinner will be served within the hour. I've had rooms prepared for you both, and Thomas will see that your luggage is brought up immediately." We followed her into Ashworth Hall, and I felt myself crossing a threshold in more than merely physical terms, entering not just a building, but a story, a mystery that had been waiting for us, for precisely these people at precisely this moment, as though all of history had conspired to bring us to this place on this evening. The entrance hall was magnificent, stone-flagged floor worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, walls lined with portraits of Ashworth's long dead, their painted eyes seeming to watch our passage with expressions ranging from welcoming to stern to enigmatically neutral. A great fireplace dominated one wall, large enough that a person could stand upright within it, and a fire blazed there now, radiating welcome warmth after the cold journey. Above us, hammer-beam timbers supported the ceiling, dark with age and smoke, their carved ends depicting various creatures and symbols I could not immediately identify in the flickering firelight. "I thought we might dine informally in the small dining room," Lady Catherine said, as she led us deeper into the hall, down corridors whose stones whispered of age and stability. "My younger sister, Beatrice, will join us. She has been most eager to meet you both. Otherwise, we shall be quite private, which I hope will make it easier to discuss the matters that bring you here." We passed through several rooms, each giving impressions of comfortable antiquity, of furniture that had served generations, of accumulated history visible in every object and arrangement. The hall had that particular quality of homes that have been continuously inhabited by the same family for centuries. Not museum-like perfection, but rather the organic accumulation of lives lived, choices made, preferences expressed across spans of time that dwarfed individual existence. Finally, we arrived at what Lady Catherine had called the small dining room, though small seemed a relative term. It could easily have accommodated 20 diners, though tonight it was set for 4, the places clustered at one end of a long table of dark wood polished to a deep gleam. A fire burned here as well, and candles supplemented the fire's light, creating an atmosphere that was both intimate and slightly formal, appropriate for the strange nature of our gathering, host and guests, but also client and investigators, exploring matters that mixed personal tragedy with inexplicable mystery. "I'll have someone show you to your rooms, so you may refresh yourselves before dinner," Lady Catherine said. "We dine at 8. You have just over half an hour." A young maid appeared, as if summoned by thought rather than bell, and we followed her up a broad staircase to the first floor, then down another corridor to adjacent rooms that had been prepared for our occupation. Mine was spacious and comfortable, dominated by a 4-poster bed hung with heavy curtains, with a writing desk near the window, and a fireplace where a small fire burned cheerfully. My luggage had already been brought up and placed conveniently on a chest at the foot of the bed. I washed quickly at the basin provided, changed into fresh clothes, more appropriate for dinner, and felt considerably refreshed despite the long journey. When I emerged, I found Holmes already waiting in the corridor, and together we made our way back down to the small dining room. Lady Catherine was there, and with her was a younger woman who could only be her sister Beatrice. Where Catherine conveyed strength and authority, Beatrice radiated a different quality, a delicacy that seemed almost ethereal, enhanced by her pale complexion and the dark circles beneath her eyes, that spoke of inadequate sleep, or perhaps lingering illness. She wore black as well, mourning clothes that hung on her thin frame in a way that suggested recent weight loss, and her hands moved nervously as she greeted us, never quite still. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said softly, her voice barely rising above a whisper. "Thank you for coming. Edmund would have been so pleased to know you were investigating his death. He spoke often of Mr. Holmes's methods, of the way logic and observation could pierce through apparent impossibility to reach truth. You have my sincere condolences on your loss, Miss Ashworth," Holmes said gently, his tone modulated to match her quiet manner. "I hope we may bring your family some measure of peace through our investigation." We took our seats, Lady Catherine at the head of the table, Holmes and I on one side, Beatrice on the other, and servants began to bring in the first course, a soup that filled the room with its rich, warming aroma. For a few minutes, we ate in relative silence, the necessities of dining taking precedence over conversation, though I felt the weight of unspoken matters hanging in the air, waiting to be addressed. Finally, Lady Catherine set down her spoon and looked directly at Holmes with those penetrating eyes. "I imagine you have many questions, Mr. Holmes. Please, ask whatever you wish. My sister and I have agreed to answer with complete honesty, holding nothing back, regardless of how strange or inexplicable certain matters may seem." Holmes nodded acknowledgement, then asked his first question. "Tell me about your brother Edmund in the weeks before his death. You mentioned in your letter that his behavior changed significantly. Can you provide specific details about these changes?" Lady Catherine and Beatrice exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them, and then Catherine began to speak, her voice steady, despite the emotion I could detect beneath its surface. "Edmund had always been scholarly, even as a child. He loved books and history, spent hours in our library, showed little interest in the practical aspects of estate management that occupied most of my attention. This was not considered remarkable. He was the younger son, expected to pursue interests rather than responsibilities." She paused as servants cleared the soup course and brought the next, roasted pheasant with seasonal vegetables, the presentation simple but elegant. When they had withdrawn, she continued. "But approximately 6 weeks before his death, something changed. He became obsessed with a particular aspect of the estate's history, specifically with records relating to the lake. He would spend entire days in the library, emerging only for meals, and sometimes not even then. He filled notebooks with dates and observations, copied passages from old documents, seemed driven by a need to understand something he would not explain to us." "Did he share any of his findings with you?" Holmes inquired, his attention focused entirely on Catherine's narrative. "Only fragments," Beatrice interjected, her soft voice requiring all of us to lean slightly forward to hear clearly. "He would sometimes appear at dinner and make strange comments about cycles, about water as a gateway, about sacrifice and necessity. When pressed for clarification, he would simply smile and say he was still formulating his theory, that he needed to be certain before sharing it with us." She fell silent, her eyes distant, clearly revisiting painful memories. Catherine took up the narrative thread. In the final week, his behavior became even more unusual. He stopped sleeping in his room. We would find him at dawn, seated in the library, or walking the grounds near the lake, seemingly having not slept at all. He looked exhausted, driven by something beyond normal energy. On the last night, December 14th, he came to me specifically to say goodbye. Her voice caught slightly on the final word, the first real crack in her composed facade. Holmes waited patiently, not pressing, allowing her time to compose herself. He said, Catherine continued after a moment, "Sister, if something happens to me, know that it is necessary and chosen. Do not let them call it accident or tragedy. It is neither. It is completion." Those were his exact words, Mr. Holmes. I asked what he meant, tried to persuade him to explain, but he only smiled sadly and said I would understand in time. He kissed my forehead, which he had not done since we were children, and then he left. That was the last time I saw him alive. The dining room had grown very quiet, even the small sounds of fire and candles seeming to diminish, as though the room itself were listening to this tragic account. Holmes's expression revealed nothing of his thoughts, but I knew him well enough to recognize the intense focus behind his apparent calm. And the following day, Holmes prompted gently, "He was discovered missing at first light," Catherine replied. "Brennan, the man who drove you here, found Edmund's room empty when he went to wake him for an appointment we had scheduled regarding estate business. We searched the hall and grounds, and within an hour we found him." She stopped speaking, unable or unwilling to continue, and Beatrice took over, her whisper-soft voice somehow more affecting than louder speech would have been. "He was on the lake, Mr. Holmes. The ice had frozen hard during the night. It had been unseasonably cold, and Edmund was lying upon it, about 30 feet from the shore, his arms stretched out, as Catherine described in her letter, his face peaceful, despite the manner of his death. The physician said he had been there most of the night, that death had come from exposure primarily, though there was water in his lungs as well, suggesting he had fallen through at some point and pulled himself back onto the surface before finally succumbing. Was there any evidence of how he reached that position? Holmes asked. Footprints? Tracks of any kind? Only his own, Catherine confirmed. A single line of footprints leading from the shore to where he lay, and there was some disruption in the ice nearby, consistent with a person breaking through and pulling themselves back up. The authorities concluded he had walked onto ice that was not as thick as he believed, broke through, managed to escape the water, but was too exhausted and cold to return to shore, and died where he collapsed. But you do not believe this explanation, Holmes stated, rather than asked. The ice was thick enough everywhere else, Catherine said firmly. Brennan tested it extensively afterward. It was solid, several inches deep in all places, except for the area immediately around where Edmund broke through. And there's the matter of his expression, Mr. Holmes. I have seen death, in my father and in others. I have seen the faces of those who die in fear or pain. Edmund's expression was not like that at all. He looked content, accepting, as though he had achieved what he set out to do. Holmes was silent for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in that characteristic pose. Finally, he asked, "The numbers and dates found in his room, the sequence you transcribed in your letter, were there other notes accompanying them? Any indication of what these dates meant to him?" Only a single word written beside them, Catherine said. He had written convergence, underlined twice. Nothing else. No explanation of what might converge or why these particular dates mattered. The main course had been largely forgotten by all of us. though servants came and went, clearing plates and bringing the next course with the discretion of well-trained staff accustomed to dining conversations of serious nature. Wine had been poured, and Holmes took a small sip before asking his next question. "I would like to examine Edmund's room and papers at first opportunity," he said. "Additionally, I wish to visit the lake itself, to observe the location where he was found. But first, tell me about the phenomena you mentioned in your letter, the strange occurrences reported since Edmund's death. Who has witnessed these things, and under what circumstances?" Catherine and Beatrice exchanged another glance, and I saw reluctance in both their faces, as though speaking of these matters gave them reality they preferred to deny. "Multiple members of the household staff have reported seeing lights beneath the ice at night," Catherine began slowly. "Not reflections of moon or stars, but lights that move independently, that seem to follow paths beneath the frozen surface. Thomas Brennan saw them himself 3 weeks ago and reported them to me directly. He's not a fanciful man, Mr. Holmes, not given to imagination or superstition." "I've seen them as well," Beatrice added, her voice even quieter than before. "I walk sometimes at night when sleep will not come. I've stood at my window, which overlooks the lake, and watched lights moving beneath the ice, tracing patterns I could not quite make sense of, but which seemed deliberate, purposeful." "And the sounds?" Holmes prompted. "Like ice breaking," Catherine said, "but more rhythmic, more regular than natural freezing and thawing would produce. A cracking sound that repeats at intervals, always at night, always originating from the lake's center. Several servants have refused to go near the water after dark now, claiming they feel watched, that there's a presence around the lake that was not there before Edmund's death." Holmes sat back in his chair, his eyes distant, clearly processing this information and integrating it with whatever theories were forming in that remarkable mind. "And before Edmund's death," he asked, "were there any reports of unusual phenomena associated with the lake in earlier times?" "Nothing documented recently," Catherine replied, "but Edmund had found references in old family papers, accounts from previous centuries describing similar events. He showed me one entry from 1747, written by a family steward, describing strange illuminations upon the mere's frozen surface, and the young master venturing upon the ice in his nightclothes, only saved from drowning by the prompt action of his servants." "The date Edmund had noted," Holmes observed. "December 15th, 1747. "Exactly," Catherine confirmed. "He found similar references for other dates in his sequence, though more oblique, harder to verify. The records from 1347 are fragmentary at best. The Black Death disrupted everything, including careful record-keeping. But he believed he had found a pattern extending back at least that far, possibly earlier. Dessert appeared, a trifle rich with cream and fruit, accompanied by a sweet wine, but none of us showed much appetite for it. The conversation had cast a pall over the meal, replacing physical hunger with a hunger for understanding, for explanation that could make sense of tragedy and mystery. "I should like to examine those documents Edmund found," Holmes said. "In fact, I would appreciate complete access to your library and family archives. If there are answers to be found, they likely reside in the historical record your brother was studying." "Most thoughtful," Holmes acknowledged. "And tomorrow, at first light, I wish to examine the lake thoroughly, to see the location where Edmund was found, and to assess the current state of the ice and surrounding area. Thomas can guide you. Catherine offered. "He knows every inch of the grounds, and he can show you precisely where we found Edmund." The meal concluded, and Catherine led Holmes and me through a series of corridors to the library, a magnificent room that occupied what I guessed was most of the hall's oldest tower. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, accessed by rolling ladders of polished brass and dark wood. Ancient volumes bound in leather shared space with more recent acquisitions, creating a collection that represented centuries of intellectual curiosity and careful curation. Several reading tables occupied the room's centre, and one of these was indeed covered with papers, open books, and notebooks filled with Edmund's handwriting. Candles and lamps provided warm illumination, supplementing the fire that burned in yet another massive fireplace. The room smelled of old paper and leather, of wood smoke and candle wax, the accumulated scent of knowledge and contemplation. "I'll leave you gentlemen to explore," Catherine said. "I know you'll wish to examine Edmund's work without distraction. Should you need anything, simply ring. There's a bell pull by the fireplace. I'll have coffee brought up shortly. I imagine you'll be here for some hours." She departed, and Holmes immediately moved to the table, where Edmund's research lay scattered, his movements sharp with anticipation and focused energy. I joined him, and together we began to examine what the late Edmund Ashworth had discovered about his family's estate, and the mysterious pattern that had ultimately led him to the frozen lake. The notebooks revealed a mind grappling with something vast and strange, recording observations and theories in handwriting that became increasingly agitated as the dates progressed toward December 15th. Edmund had indeed identified a pattern. He had found references to events on the lake spanning centuries, always occurring on the same date, always involving a member of the Ashworth family, always ending in near drowning or actual death. 1347. The young lord was found upon the mere at dawn, frost-touched and senseless, babbling of voices from the deeps calling him homeward. 1447. The ice gave way beneath Sir Thomas, yet he was preserved by God's grace, though much afflicted in mind thereafter. 1547. A most strange occurrence, the waters calling forth young Robert, who walked upon the frozen mere, and would have perished but for intervention. 1647. No record found, though Edmund had noted that the estate archives from this period were incomplete. Many documents lost during the Civil War. In 1747, the account Catherine had mentioned of a young Ashworth saved from drowning. 1847. The heir was discovered upon the ice, having wandered there in sleep, and though he did not drown, he spoke thereafter of dreams and voices that gave him no peace. And now 1947, with Edmund himself completing the century's sacrifice. For that was the word Edmund had used repeatedly in his later notes: sacrifice. He had written, "The pattern demands completion. Water calls to blood, and blood must answer. What was begun centuries ago continues, each completion enabling the next, a cycle without end, unless someone chooses to fulfill its demand willingly, consciously, becoming not victim, but willing participant." Holmes read these passages multiple times, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Watson," he said eventually, "what do you make of this?" I considered carefully before responding. It appears Edmund convinced himself he was meant to die, that some ancient pattern required his death specifically at this time. Whether such a pattern truly exists objectively, or whether he constructed it from historical coincidence and then acted upon his own construction, that seems the essential question. Well reasoned, Holmes acknowledged. We have several possibilities to consider. First, pure coincidence. Random events that Edmund connected through pattern seeking that saw meaning where none objectively existed. Second, a historical pattern that, once discovered, exerted psychological pressure, leading Edmund to fulfill it through a form of self-fulfilling prophecy. Third, some genuine phenomenon associated with this location that has indeed claimed lives at regular intervals across centuries. He fell silent, turning pages in Edmund's notebooks, examining copied passages from old documents, occasionally making small sounds of interest or surprise at what he found. Coffee arrived, brought by a servant who set the tray down silently and departed without interrupting our concentration. I poured for both of us, grateful for the warmth and the slight stimulation the beverage provided. The clock on the mantel showed nearly midnight. We had been in the library for over 2 hours, and outside the tall windows the night pressed close, deep and dark, save for the light of stars and moon. "Look here, Watson," Holmes said suddenly, gesturing to a page in one of the old ledgers Edmund had been consulting. "This is from 1746, the year before the incident Edmund noted. It's an accounting of estate expenses, including payment to J. Morden for consultation regarding the mere and measures to prevent recurrence of past misfortunes." "Someone attempted to prevent the pattern even then," I observed. "Indeed, and if we assume the attempt failed, given that someone nearly drowned the following year, we must ask what they tried and why it didn't work." Holmes's eyes gleamed with the intensity of intellectual pursuit. "Edmund makes reference to something else as well. Look here, in his last notebook entries." He opened to a page dated December 10th, just days before Edmund's death, where the handwriting was particularly agitated, sentences broken and fragmentary. Not curse, but contract. Original purpose lost to time. They believed they were ensuring prosperity, binding land to water through blood. But the entity bound cares nothing for intention, only continuance. It feeds on completion, grows stronger with each century, unless someone breaks the cycle by meeting it fully conscious, accepting rather than fleeing. "Entity," I said, unable to keep skepticism from my voice. "Holmes, surely we're not to believe in some supernatural presence dwelling in the lake." "I believe in evidence, Watson, and in following that evidence wherever it leads, regardless of how uncomfortable the destination might be for our preconceived notions of reality." Holmes's voice was patient but firm. "Consider, if multiple witnesses across centuries report similar phenomena at the same location on the same date, we must account for those reports. Either there is systematic delusion or record falsification spanning centuries, itself a remarkable claim, or something does occur at this location that produces consistent observable effects." He moved to the window, gazing out toward where the lake would be, though in the darkness, only moonlight reflecting off ice was visible from our vantage point. "Edmund believed he could end the pattern by consciously choosing what previous victims had encountered accidentally or unwillingly. He theorized that the entity, for lack of a better term, derived power from fear and unwilling submission, and that conscious acceptance might break its hold." "And did it?" I asked quietly. "That," Holmes said, turning back to me, "is precisely what we must determine. Is the pattern continuing, or did Edmund's sacrifice achieve its purpose? The reports of lights and sounds since his death suggest either that the phenomenon continues unabated, or that something else is occurring, perhaps a final manifestation before the pattern ceases, or perhaps witnesses are projecting meaning onto natural phenomena in the wake of tragedy. We continued our examination of Edmund's research for another hour, but found little additional information that significantly altered our understanding. The young man had been thorough in his investigation, had identified a genuine pattern of events, and had developed a theory, whether valid or delusional, about how to end that pattern. He had then acted upon his theory, with fatal results. Finally, Holmes straightened and stretched, the gesture uncharacteristically showing fatigue. "We should retire, Watson. Tomorrow will be demanding, and I wish to observe the lake in full daylight before attempting any more extensive investigation. My mind works better after adequate rest, despite what some imagine about my working methods." We extinguished most of the candles and lamps, leaving one burning to guide any servants who might need to access the room, and made our way through the now quiet halls back to our rooms. The hall had settled into its nighttime rhythms, the sounds different from daytime, creaks and settling sounds, the whisper of wind around ancient stones, the distant call of some nocturnal bird outside. At my door, Holmes paused. "Sleep well, Watson, and if you hear anything unusual during the night, do not investigate alone. Come fetch me first. I do not believe we are in danger, but prudence suggests caution in situations where our understanding is incomplete." I promised to do so, and retired to my room, finding a fire still burning low in the grate, and the bed turned down by unseen servants. I prepared for sleep and climbed between cool sheets that gradually warmed with my body's heat, and lay there listening to the sounds of Ashworth Hall at night. Sleep was long in coming. My mind churned with the day's revelations, with patterns and dates and mysterious deaths spanning centuries. I thought of Edmund Ashworth, young and scholarly, convincing himself that his death could serve some greater purpose, walking onto ice in the darkest hour of night to meet whatever awaited him there. I thought of his sisters, left behind to puzzle over his choice and mourn his absence. I thought of Holmes, approaching this mystery with his characteristic blend of skepticism and openness, determined to find truth regardless of how strange that truth might prove. Eventually, sleep found me, and I dreamed of frozen lakes that reflected not the sky, but depths beyond imagining, of lights moving in darkness, of patterns that repeated endlessly unless someone possessed the courage or foolishness to disrupt them. In my dreams, I walked onto ice that sang beneath my feet, and voices called from the water, though whether in warning or invitation I could not tell. I woke once in the deep night, unsure what had disturbed me, and lay listening to silence that was not quite silence, subtle sounds whose origin I could not identify, a quality to the darkness that suggested awareness, attention, presence. But nothing threatening materialized, and eventually I drifted back into sleep, and the night passed without incident. Morning arrived with pale sunlight filtering through frost-covered windows, creating intricate patterns of ice crystals that caught and refracted the light into small rainbows. I woke feeling surprisingly refreshed, despite the strangeness of the previous day and my fragmented sleep. When I descended to breakfast, I found Holmes already there, consuming toast and eggs with the single-minded focus he brought to most physical activities, treating eating as fuel rather than pleasure. "Good morning, Watson," he greeted me cheerfully. "I trust you slept adequately." I confess I found the quiet here wonderfully conducive to rest. London's constant noise becomes so familiar, one forgets it's there until experiencing its absence. Lady Catherine joined us shortly, followed by Beatrice, who looked, if anything, more pale and exhausted than the previous evening. Breakfast was substantial. Eggs, bacon, toast, preserves, strong tea, and we ate while discussing the day's plans. "Brennan is ready to accompany you to the lake whenever you wish," Catherine informed us. "The ice remains solid, though we've had a slight warming trend that may weaken it in the coming days. I would ask that you exercise appropriate caution, Mr. Holmes. I have no wish to add another tragedy to our family's history." "Your concern is appreciated and will be heeded," Holmes assured her. "I have no intention of testing the ice's thickness personally. Observation from shore will suffice for my purposes." After breakfast, we dressed warmly for outdoor exploration. Heavy coats, scarves, gloves, the protective layers necessary for a December morning in Northumberland. Brennan met us at the hall's entrance, and together we set out across the grounds toward the lake. The landscape in daylight revealed itself as starkly beautiful. Rolling grounds with scattered trees, their branches bare against the winter sky, and beyond them the hills rising in layers toward more distant peaks. Everything wore frost's decorative touch, transforming ordinary vegetation into crystal gardens that glittered in the morning light. As we walked, Brennan spoke in his straightforward northern manner about the estate and the lake. "I've worked here 20 years, Mr. Holmes, and I've never known the mere to be anything but what it appears. A body of water, cold and deep, useful for skating in winter and fishing in summer. But this past year, since young Mr. Edmund's death, it's been different. Can't quite put my finger on how, but different nonetheless." "Different in what way?" Holmes inquired, his eyes constantly moving, observing details of landscape and vegetation, the placement of structures, the configuration of the land. "Feels watched, if that makes sense," Brennan said, his discomfort with the admission evident in his tone. "And the lights at night, I've seen them myself, Mr. Holmes, not once, but several times. They're not imagination, whatever explanation they might have. They move beneath the ice, following paths that seem deliberate, occasionally pausing as if examining things." We crested a small rise, and the lake came into full view, larger than I had realized, perhaps 300 yards at its widest point, roughly oval in shape, surrounded by a margin of frozen earth and winter dead rushes. The surface was ice, uniformly grey-white, perfectly smooth, save for one area perhaps 30 feet from the shore, where some disruption had occurred and frozen again in a rougher configuration. "That's where we found him," Brennan said quietly, pointing to the disturbed area. "Right there, lying on his back, arms stretched out, face peaceful as a sleeping child. I've seen death before, Mr. Holmes, in war and accident and illness, but I've never seen anything quite like how Mr. Edmund looked, as though death had been welcome, expected, embraced." Holmes moved closer to the shore, his eyes fixed on the ice, on the disturbed area, on the configuration of the landscape. He took a small notebook from his pocket and began sketching rapidly, capturing the scene's geometry with quick, confident lines. "The ice broke here," he murmured, more to himself than to us, yet everywhere else remained solid. Temperature was uniform, so why did this specific area give way? He turned to Brennan. Is there anything unusual about this location? Springs feeding the lake, underground streams, anything that might affect ice formation differently here than elsewhere? Brennan shook his head. Not that I know of. The mere is spring-fed, but the primary springs are at the far end there. He pointed to the lake's opposite shore. Nothing particular about this spot that I'm aware of. Holmes completed his sketch and stood motionless for several minutes, simply observing, his mind clearly working through possibilities and theories. I remained silent, knowing from long experience that interrupting his concentration at such moments served no purpose. Finally, he spoke. "Watson, note the configuration of the surrounding hills. The lake sits at what is essentially the valley's lowest point, with higher ground on all sides. This creates a natural basin, but more significantly, it means that this location would have been recognizable as significant from earliest human habitation. A gathering point for water, a place where the landscape itself directs attention." I saw what he meant. The hills formed a rough circle around the lake, not perfectly regular, but close enough that the eye perceived intentional arrangement, even while the mind recognized natural formation. "And look there," Holmes continued, pointing to the northern shore. "Those stones, half buried and overgrown. What do you make of those, Brennan?" The groom squinted in the indicated direction. "Been there long as I can remember, Mr. Holmes. Just old stones, I always thought, though some say they're remains of something older. Maybe that stone circle the stories mention." Holmes's eyes lit with interest. "I should like to examine those more closely. Watson, are you game for a walk around the lake's perimeter?" I agreed readily, and we set off, following the shoreline in a clockwise direction, Brennan accompanying us and providing commentary on various features of the landscape. The walk took perhaps 40 minutes, the ground uneven and occasionally treacherous with frost, but the exercise was welcome after the previous day's long journey. The stones Holmes had spotted proved to be quite large, each perhaps 4 feet tall, dark grey granite, weathered by centuries of exposure, but clearly placed deliberately, rather than scattered by natural forces. There were 6 of them visible, forming a partial circle, with gaps suggesting others had fallen or been moved over the years. "This is quite significant," Holmes said, his voice carrying excitement, poorly concealed by attempted professional detachment. "These are unmistakably worked stone, shaped by human hands, and their placement in relation to the lake is too precise to be coincidental. I would estimate, purely speculatively, mind you, that these date to Bronze Age at the latest, possibly earlier." He moved among the stones, examining each carefully, occasionally brushing away accumulated soil and vegetation to expose more of their surfaces. On one, he found what appeared to be carved marks, though so worn by time that their original form was impossible to determine with certainty. "Brennan," Holmes called out, "has anyone conducted archaeological investigation of these stones? Scholarly examination of any kind?" "Not in my time here," Brennan replied. "Mr. Edmund was interested in them, spent time sketching and measuring them last autumn, before he became obsessed with the dates and the lake. He mentioned once that he thought they might be part of a larger complex, that there could be more buried under the soil and vegetation." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. Edmund was correct to see significance here. These stones establish that this location has been recognized as important for millennia, long before the Ashworth family, long before written records. Humans marked this place as meaningful. The question becomes, Why this location specifically? And is there continuity between that ancient recognition and the pattern Edmund identified? We continued our circuit of the lake, completing the full perimeter and returning to our starting point. The sun had climbed higher, and though the temperature remained well below freezing, the light was bright and clear, the winter sky a pale, delicate blue. "I've seen what I needed to see for now," Holmes announced. "This afternoon, I wish to return to the library and examine more of the estate's historical records, particularly anything relating to the lake and the surrounding landscape. Tonight, if conditions permit and you're willing, Watson, I propose we observe the lake after dark to see if the reported phenomena manifest." I agreed, though I confessed to some trepidation about spending hours in the cold darkness, watching for lights beneath ice. Still, Holmes's investigations required such commitment, and I had long since accepted that accompanying him meant embracing both comfort and discomfort, safety and calculated risk. We returned to the hall, and after a warming lunch, Holmes sequestered himself in the library with Catherine's permission to examine any documents he wished. I spent the afternoon writing in my journal and examining the hall's public rooms, finding much to admire in the accumulated artifacts and artworks of 6 centuries of continuous family habitation. Beatrice found me in the portrait gallery, where I was studying a particularly fine Renaissance painting of an Ashworth ancestor. "Dr. Watson," she said softly, her perpetual quietness making me start slightly at her unexpected presence. "May I speak with you privately?" "Of course, Miss Ashworth," I replied, turning to give her my full attention. In the afternoon light, she looked even more frail than before, almost translucent, as though she were gradually fading from the world of solid things. She glanced around, ensuring we were alone, then spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "I wanted to tell you something I did not mention last night, something I have told no one, not even Catherine. I was afraid they would think me mad, or that grief had unbalanced my mind." I waited patiently, giving her space to continue at her own pace. "The night Edmund died," she said, "I could not sleep. I stood at my window. My room faces the lake, as I mentioned, and I saw him walking toward the water. The moon was bright, and I could see him clearly, his white nightshirt almost glowing in the moonlight. I watched him walk onto the ice, and I thought I should call out, raise alarm, but something prevented me. Not fear, but rather a sense that what I was witnessing was inevitable, that interference would be meaningless." Her hands trembled as she spoke, and I gently guided her to a bench beneath one of the portraits, sitting beside her and waiting for her to compose herself enough to continue. "He walked to the center of the lake," she resumed, "and then he stopped. He stood completely still for what seemed like hours, but was probably only minutes. And then, Dr. Watson, this is the part that sounds mad. The ice beneath him began to glow. Light shone up through it, surrounding him, and he raised his arms as though in greeting or surrender. The light grew brighter, and I could see shapes within it, moving beneath the ice, forms I could not quite make out, but which seemed almost human in configuration, or humanoid at least. She paused, her breath coming faster, clearly distressed by the memory. I placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, saying nothing, simply offering silent support. The light surrounded him completely, and then the ice broke. I heard the crack even from my distant window. Edmund fell through, but the light continued, pulsing beneath the surface. I stood frozen, unable to move or cry out, and I watched that light gradually dim and disappear. When it was gone, Edmund pulled himself partially back onto the ice, and then he was still. I stood at that window until dawn, watching him lie there, and I felt. This is the strangest part. I felt that he was not alone, that something remained with him until the sun rose and others came to find him. Tears streaked her pale cheeks now, and she turned to me with desperate eyes. "Do you think me mad, Dr. Watson? Catherine would if I told her. She is so practical, so determined to find rational explanations. But I know what I saw, and I feel that something still lingers in that lake. Something Edmund met and did not entirely banish despite his sacrifice." I considered carefully before responding. "Miss Ashworth, I am a medical man trained in observation and diagnosis. I do not dismiss reported phenomena merely because they are unusual or unexpected. Mr. Holmes has taught me to separate what we observe from our interpretation of what we observe. You saw lights and shapes that you cannot fully explain. That is observation. That they represent some supernatural entity. That is interpretation. Both may be valid, but we must distinguish between them." She nodded slowly, seeming comforted by my measured response. "Will you tell Mr. Holmes what I've shared? I confess I lack the courage to tell him myself. He is so formidable, so analytical. I fear his skepticism." "Holmes is skeptical of unexamined assumptions," I corrected gently, "but he is open to evidence, regardless of where it leads. I will share your account with him, with your permission, and I believe he will take it seriously as potentially important testimony." "Thank you," she whispered, and we sat together in silence for a few minutes more before she excused herself, drifting away down the corridor like a ghost herself, insubstantial and sorrowful. I found Holmes still in the library, surrounded by even more documents than the previous night, his eyes bright with the light of discovery. "Watson," he exclaimed upon seeing me, "I've found something quite remarkable. Look at this. It's a property survey from 1612, showing the estate's boundaries and notable features." He spread the yellowed document carefully on the table, pointing to a detailed illustration of the lake and surrounding area. "Notice anything interesting about the placement of structures?" I examined the map carefully. The hall was marked, as were various outbuildings and field boundaries. But what caught my attention was a notation near the lake itself. "Site of old chapel, ruins only." "There was a chapel here?" I asked. "Indeed, and not just any chapel. I found references to it in several other documents. It was built in the 11th century, shortly after the Norman conquest, specifically on this site, because, and here's where it becomes fascinating, the site was already considered sacred or significant. The chapel was built deliberately to Christianize a location that had pagan associations, a common practice in that era." Holmes pulled out another document, this one even older, a fragment of medieval Latin that he translated as he read. "The waters called Murden's Pool, wherein dwells a spirit of great antiquity, neither Christian nor heathen, but older than both, which the common folk fear and propitiate with offerings." This is from 1203, Watson, a full century before the Black Death, nearly 8 centuries before Edmund's death. "So, the location has been recognized as unusual for at least that long," I observed, "and likely much longer. The stones we examined this morning predate the medieval chapel by millennia. This has been a significant location for as long as humans have inhabited this region, possibly 5,000 years or more. The pattern Edmund identified, the cycle of events occurring every century, may be merely the most recent manifestation of something far older. I shared with him then what Beatrice had told me, relating her account of Edmund's final moments as she witnessed them. Holmes listened with complete attention, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly allowing me to convey her testimony without interruption. When I finished, he sat back, his expression thoughtful. So, we have direct observation of luminous phenomena accompanying Edmund's death, confirming that something objectively observable occurred beyond mere drowning. This is significant evidence, Watson, regardless of how we ultimately interpret it. He stood and began pacing, a sure sign his mind was racing through possibilities. Consider what we know, an ancient site, recognized as significant across millennia, a pattern of deaths or near-deaths occurring at precise century intervals, luminous phenomena reported by multiple witnesses, and a young man who, after extensive research, concluded that conscious sacrifice might end the pattern. He acted on that belief, died in the attempt, and yet phenomena continue to be reported, suggesting either his effort failed or the aftermath of success includes these manifestations. "What do you propose?" I asked. "Tonight we observe," Holmes stated firmly. "We station ourselves in a position with clear view of the lake and watch through the night. If phenomena manifest, we document them as carefully as possible. If nothing occurs, that too is significant data. I have learned, Watson, that some mysteries yield their secrets only to patient observation." The remainder of the afternoon passed in continued research and preparation for our nocturnal vigil. Catherine, upon learning of our plan, had Brennan prepare a sort of shelter on the grounds overlooking the lake. A sturdy structure with walls on 3 sides, open toward the water, with a small brazier for heat and comfortable seating, allowing us to maintain watch while protected from the worst of the weather. We dined at the usual hour, and this time the conversation was less focused on tragedy and mystery, more an ordinary evening's exchange among people becoming comfortable with each other's company. Catherine proved to be well-read and intellectually curious, and she and Holmes discussed various topics ranging from the latest archaeological discoveries in Egypt to the political situation in Europe. Beatrice spoke little, but seemed more at peace than before, perhaps relieved at having shared her burden of witnessed events. As night fell, Holmes and I dressed in our warmest clothes, gathered notebooks and pencils for recording observations, and made our way to the shelter Brennan had prepared. It was situated on the rise, where we had first viewed the lake that morning, providing an excellent vantage point while keeping us relatively comfortable. The night was clear and bitterly cold, the stars emerging in vast numbers as darkness deepened, the moon rising late and near full, bathing everything in silver light. The lake was a sheet of pale luminescence, perfectly still, perfectly smooth, reflecting the heavens like an enormous mirror. We settled into our vigil, and the hours began to pass slowly, marked by the gradual wheeling of stars across the sky, the moon's stately progress from horizon to zenith, and the occasional sounds of nocturnal creatures going about their business. The call of an owl, the bark of a fox somewhere in the distance, the rustle of wind through bare branches. Holmes remained alert but relaxed, occasionally making notes about the passage of time and the configuration of stars, treating the exercise as both investigation and meditation. I felt my attention waver periodically. The combination of cold and stillness creating a hypnotic effect. But I forced myself to remain focused on the lake, watching for any change, any manifestation of the phenomena others had reported. Midnight passed, then 1 o'clock, and I began to wonder if this night would prove uneventful, if the phenomena occurred only on certain nights, or under certain conditions we had not met. But then, as the moon approached its zenith and the night reached its deepest point, something changed. The lake began to glow. It was subtle at first, so faint I thought it might be imagination or a trick of moonlight, but it strengthened gradually, an emanation of light from beneath the ice, pale blue-green in colour, distributed not uniformly, but in patterns that seemed to shift and flow like water itself. "Do you see it?" I whispered to Holmes, though there was no reason to whisper. "Indeed," he replied, his voice tight with excitement and concentration. "Most remarkable. Note how the light moves, Watson, not randomly, but in paths, almost like currents flowing beneath the ice." The luminosity intensified, and I could now make out distinct areas of brightness, ribbons and pools of light that moved with dreamlike slowness beneath the frozen surface. The patterns were hypnotic, drawing the eye and holding it, creating almost a trance-like state in the observer. And then, as Beatrice had described, shapes began to appear within the light, vague forms that might have been human or might have been merely suggestions of humanity, the mind imposing familiar patterns on unfamiliar phenomena. They moved with the light, seeming to glide beneath the ice, occasionally pausing as though aware of observation, as though looking back at us even as we watched them. "Are you seeing figures?" Holmes asked quietly, his eyes never leaving the lake. "I see something," I confirmed. Whether figures or patterns my mind interprets as figures, I cannot say with certainty. The display continued for perhaps 20 minutes, the lights ebbing and flowing, the shapes appearing and dissolving, creating a spectacle that was simultaneously beautiful and unsettling. Then, gradually, the phenomenon began to diminish, the light fading, the shapes disappearing, until only the ordinary moonlit ice remained, giving no hint of the extraordinary events we had just witnessed. We sat in silence for several minutes, both processing what we had observed. Finally, Holmes spoke. "Whatever explanation ultimately accounts for what we just witnessed, Watson, we can state definitively that something observable and consistent occurs at this location. Multiple witnesses across time have reported similar phenomena, and we have now confirmed those reports through direct observation. This is significant." "But what is it?" I asked, the question that seemed most pressing. "Some natural phenomenon we don't understand, or something more unusual?" Holmes's expression was troubled, a rare uncertainty showing through his usual confidence. "I confess, Watson, that this case challenges my methodologies in ways I did not anticipate. The phenomena we observed could potentially have natural explanations. Bioluminescence, as I mentioned earlier, or some kind of light refraction or phosphorescence. But the consistency of reports across centuries, the apparent intelligence in the movements, the correlation with specific dates and human deaths. These elements suggest a complexity that simple natural phenomenon does not fully explain." We remained in our shelter for several more hours, but the phenomena did not repeat. As dawn approached, we made our way back to the hall, cold and exhausted, but carrying with us the weight of what we had witnessed. The following days passed in a pattern of investigation and contemplation. Holmes spent mornings and afternoons in the library, excavating ever deeper into Ashworth family history and the history of the surrounding region. I accompanied him sometimes, assisting with document examination, but often I walked the grounds or conversed with Catherine and Beatrice, piecing together a more complete picture of Edmund's final weeks from their recollections and observations. Several more nights we maintained vigil at the lake, and twice more we witnessed the luminous phenomena, never exactly the same, but always following similar patterns. Lights beneath the ice, forms within the light, a sense of intelligence and awareness emanating from the lake itself. Holmes also conducted interviews with household staff, carefully documenting their experiences and observations. Many had seen the lights. Several reported feeling watched when near the lake, but none could offer explanations beyond the supernatural interpretations that came naturally to minds seeking meaning in mystery. On the 5th day of our stay, Holmes emerged from the library with an expression of grim satisfaction I had learned to recognize. He had found something significant, a piece that helped the puzzle resolve into greater clarity. "Watson," he said, finding me in the morning room where I had been writing letters, "I believe I have assembled enough information to present a coherent theory about this case, though whether it will bring comfort or merely different kinds of questions remains to be seen. Will you join me in presenting my findings to Lady Catherine and her sister?" We gathered in the small drawing room, Holmes, myself, Catherine, and Beatrice, and Holmes began his explanation, speaking in the careful, measured tones he employed when discussing conclusions drawn from complex evidence. "Lady Catherine, Miss Ashworth, I have spent these past days immersed in your family's history and the history of this location, and I believe I can now offer some understanding of the events that led to your brother's death, though I confess the explanation raises as many philosophical questions as it resolves practical mysteries." He paused, organizing his thoughts, then continued. "This location, the lake you call Mere's End, has been recognized as significant for at least 5,000 years, and possibly longer. The stone circle, whose remnants we examined, dates to the Bronze Age, around 2000 BC, and was clearly built to mark this specific site as important. Why this location? I can only speculate, but certain geographic features suggest possibilities. The lake sits at the convergence of several underground watercourses. I found references in geological surveys conducted in that identified multiple springs feeding the lake from below. Water, in many ancient belief systems, was seen as a boundary between worlds, and places where water emerged from the earth were particularly sacred. Add to this the natural amphitheatre created by the surrounding hills, and you have a location that would naturally draw attention as special, significant, numinous. Catherine leaned forward, her intelligent eyes fixed on Holmes's face. "You're saying ancient peoples marked this as a sacred site?" "Precisely, and more than merely marking it. They appear to have conducted rituals here, possibly including what we would call sacrifices, though the original purpose and meaning of those sacrifices is lost to time. What survives are echoes, reverberations of practices that established patterns this location seems to maintain." Holmes produced several documents, spreading them on the table. "Your brother Edmund discovered that deaths or near-deaths occurred at this lake at 100-year intervals, always on December 15th. I have verified his research and found it substantially accurate. The pattern holds as far back as 1347, and references suggest it may extend even further into the past, though documentation becomes too fragmentary to confirm. The critical question becomes, why this pattern? Random chance cannot account for such precise regularity across centuries. Edmund came to believe, and I find his reasoning sound, given the evidence, that the original ritual practices established a kind of resonance, a pattern that repeats because it was designed to repeat, because generation after generation of practitioners reinforced it until it became, in effect, self-sustaining. "You're describing something like a curse?" Beatrice asked softly, her voice trembling. "I am describing a pattern," Holmes corrected gently, "though whether we call it curse, enchantment, or simply cyclical phenomenon is largely a matter of interpretation. What matters is that the pattern exists objectively, producing observable effects. The luminous phenomena we have witnessed, and the tendency for individuals to be drawn to the lake on specific dates, often with fatal results." He paused to let this information settle before continuing. Edmund, after extensive research, came to believe that conscious participation in the pattern might disrupt or end it. He theorized that previous victims were unwilling, drawn to the lake through some form of compulsion they did not understand, and that their unwilling deaths fed the pattern, allowing it to continue. He believed that if someone approached the lake consciously, understanding what was occurring, accepting rather than fleeing, the pattern might be broken. "So he deliberately sacrificed himself," Catherine said, her voice cracking slightly with emotion. "Not from despair or madness, but from reasoned choice." "I believe so," Holmes confirmed. His notes from the final days show not deteriorating mental state, but increasing certainty, resolution hardening into determination. He believed he could end something that had claimed lives for centuries, and he possessed the courage, or some might say the foolhardiness, to attempt it. "But did it work?" I asked, the question that seemed most pressing. "The phenomena continue. We've witnessed them ourselves. Does that mean Edmund's sacrifice failed?" Holmes's expression grew complex, mixing certainty and uncertainty in unusual combination. "That is the question I have wrestled with most intensely, Watson. The phenomena continue, yes, but their character may have changed. In accounts before Edmund's death, the lake's manifestations were described in terms suggesting menace, things that drew victims toward death. Recent observations, including our own, show phenomena that seem more contemplative, perhaps even memorial. The lights move as before, but they do not call or compel. They are present, but not aggressive." He turned to Beatrice directly. "Miss Ashworth, you witnessed your brother's final moments. You described light surrounding him, and you felt something remained with him after death until dawn. May I propose an interpretation? Edmund did not banish or destroy whatever presence inhabits this lake. Such a goal may have been impossible. Rather, he transformed his relationship to it, meeting it as an equal, offering himself consciously rather than being taken as a victim. In doing so, he may have satisfied the pattern's requirement in a way that neutralizes its future compulsion. The pattern required death," Holmes continued, his voice soft but clear. "Edmund provided it willingly, and in that willingness he may have completed the cycle finally and fully. Future December 15ths may pass without tragedy, not because the lake is powerless, but because the debt, if we can call it that, has been paid in the coin of conscious choice, rather than fearful submission." Silence filled the room as we all absorbed this interpretation. It was Catherine who finally spoke, her voice steady despite visible emotion. So my brother did not die in vain. His death achieved something meaningful. I believe so, Holmes said firmly, though I acknowledge this conclusion rests partly on interpretation of evidence that defies purely materialist analysis. As a man of science and reason, I am uncomfortable with aspects of this case that seem to require accepting premises outside ordinary scientific framework. Yet, I cannot deny the evidence of my own observations, nor dismiss the pattern your brother identified, simply because it challenges my preferred modes of explanation. He looked at each of us in turn, his expression serious. What we call reality is larger and stranger than our current scientific understanding encompasses. There are more things in heaven and earth, as the bard wrote, than are dreamt of in our philosophy. This case has reminded me of that truth with particular force. Beatrice was weeping quietly, tears running down her pale face, but they seemed tears of relief rather than renewed grief. Thank you, Mr. Holmes. You've given meaning to what seemed merely tragic and senseless. Edmund's death still pains me, still leaves an absence that will never be filled, but knowing he chose it for purpose, that he may have succeeded in his goal, that he was brave rather than despairing. This helps more than I can express. Catherine took her sister's hand, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. I had hoped you would tell us this was all superstition and coincidence, that Edmund died in a tragic accident with no deeper significance. Instead, you've confirmed the mystery while making sense of it. I'm not certain whether I should feel comforted or more disturbed. Perhaps both, Holmes suggested gently. The truth is often complex, admitting of multiple emotional responses simultaneously. What I can say definitively is that your brother was neither mad nor suicidal in the conventional sense. He was a scholar who pursued truth to its conclusion, who acted on his beliefs with extraordinary courage, and who may indeed have broken a pattern of suffering that had persisted for centuries. These facts seem worth holding on to, even as questions remain about the ultimate nature of what occurred. We talked for some time longer, Holmes answering questions and elaborating on aspects of his investigation. Eventually, the conversation wound down naturally, and the emotional intensity that had filled the room dissipated gradually, replaced by a quieter sense of resolution. Incomplete, perhaps, but genuine. That evening, our last at Ashworth Hall, Lady Catherine hosted a small dinner that was less sombre than our first night's meal, touched now with something resembling peace. The conversation ranged widely, avoiding the lake and its mysteries, instead exploring art, literature, travel, the ordinary topics of civilized discourse. After dinner, Holmes and I took one final walk to the lake, standing at its shore in moonlight remarkably similar to that first night we had observed it. The ice remained solid, showing no sign of the phenomena that occurred beneath its surface. "Do you truly believe Edmund succeeded?" I asked Holmes quietly. He considered before answering, his breath creating small clouds in the cold air. "I believe he succeeded in transforming his relationship to death from passive victim to active participant. And I believe that transformation matters in ways we may not fully understand. Whether the lake will claim further victims, whether the pattern will reassert itself in future centuries. These questions cannot be answered definitively now. We can only observe, record, and attempt to understand what we observe. That's unusually uncertain coming from you, I observed. Holmes smiled slightly. This case has been instructive in the limits of certainty, Watson. I can analyze evidence, identify patterns, propose theories based on logic and observation. But when the evidence points toward phenomena that exist at the boundary of the explicable, I must acknowledge that my conclusions are probabilistic rather than definitive. I believe Edmund's sacrifice achieved something meaningful. I cannot prove it absolutely, but the weight of evidence leans toward that interpretation. We stood in comfortable silence for several minutes more, then turned and walked back to the hall, leaving the lake to its mysteries and its memories. The following morning, we prepared to depart. Our luggage had been packed, the carriage arranged, and we stood in the great entrance hall saying our farewells to Lady Catherine and Beatrice. "I cannot adequately thank you for what you've done," Catherine said, taking Holmes's hand in both of hers. "You've given us understanding and peace where we had only questions and grief. Whatever fee you charge, it cannot possibly reflect the true value of your services. Your generous payment is more than adequate," Holmes assured her, "and you have given me something perhaps more valuable, a case that challenged my assumptions and expanded my understanding of what is possible. I am grateful for that opportunity." He turned to Beatrice, who looked perhaps slightly less pale than when we'd arrived, as though some burden had been lifted. "Miss Ashworth, should you ever need to discuss what you witnessed, or should new developments occur that concern you, please do not hesitate to contact me. This case will remain open in my files, though I hope and believe no further tragedy will visit your family." She nodded, managing a small smile. "I shall sleep better now, Mr. Holmes, and I thank you for that gift." The carriage ride to Newcastle and the subsequent train journey back to London passed largely in contemplative silence. Holmes stared out the window, watching the northern landscape gradually yield to the gentler south, his mind clearly still engaged with the case's philosophical implications. Finally, as we approached London in the winter evening, he spoke. "Watson, when you write this case, and I assume you will add it to your chronicles, I ask that you treat it with particular care. It sits uneasily between the rational and the inexplicable, and I would not want it dismissed as fancy or sensation. I will do my best to convey both the evidence and the appropriate uncertainty," I promised, "though I confess I'm still processing what we witnessed and what it might mean." "As am I," Holmes admitted. "As am I." We arrived at Baker Street to find our rooms exactly as we'd left them, maintained in perfect order by the faithful Mrs. Hudson. The familiar setting seemed almost strange after the ancient atmosphere of Ashworth Hall, but gradually, as we settled into our customary chairs, and the fire was lit and tea prepared, the ordinary world reasserted itself, and the mysteries of Mere's End seemed to recede into the realm of extraordinary memory. Yet I found myself returning to those memories frequently in the days that followed, particularly on cold December nights when I would stand at my window and wonder what lights might be moving beneath frozen waters in Northumberland, what patterns continued to express themselves at the boundary between the known and the unknown. Holmes never spoke of the case unprompted, though occasionally, when examining some other mystery, he would make reference to lessons learned at Ashworth Hall, particularly regarding the need to remain open to explanations that challenged conventional frameworks of understanding. The case, I believe, changed both of us in subtle ways, making us more cautious about claiming absolute knowledge, more humble in the face of phenomena, that resisted easy categorization, more aware that the world contains depths and mysteries that reason alone may never fully illuminate. And as I sit now, years later, writing this account by the light of a gentle lamp, while rain whispers against the windows, I find myself grateful for that case, for the journey it required us to make into landscapes both geographic and intellectual, for the reminder it provided that wonder and mystery persist even in our age of science and reason, and that sometimes the most valuable conclusion we can reach is an acknowledgement that certain questions may never be definitively answered, yet are worth asking nonetheless. The frozen lake at Ashworth Hall remains, I presume, as it has for millennia, beautiful and terrible, sacred and dangerous, a boundary place where the ordinary world touches something deeper, older, and ultimately inexplicable. Edmund Ashworth sleeps in the family cemetery, his sacrifice remembered and perhaps efficacious. His sisters continue their lives, marked by loss but not destroyed by it, carrying forward their family's long history. And the pattern he identified, whether it truly ended with his conscious choice, or whether it merely rests, waiting for another century's turning, only time will reveal. Perhaps on December 15th, 2047, someone will stand at the shore of Mere's End and witness lights moving beneath the ice, and they will wonder what it means, what it requires, what ancient contract persists in being honoured or demands yet further completion. These are the mysteries we carry with us, the questions that define the boundary between the known and the unknown, the memories that remind us that reality is larger, stranger, and more wonderful than our daily experience suggests. And so, I conclude this chronicle of the Frozen Lake tragedy, not with definitive answers, but with the humble acknowledgement that some tales resist simple conclusion, some mysteries maintain their essential mystery even after investigation, and some places in this world remain touched by forces that our current understanding cannot fully encompass. May we face such mysteries with the courage Edmund Ashworth showed, with the intellectual rigour Sherlock Holmes applied, and with the open-minded wonder that allows us to acknowledge what we do not know while continuing to seek deeper understanding. Dear listener, our story finds its ending here, in this place where questions meet partial answers, where tragedy transforms into meaning, where death becomes sacrifice, and sacrifice perhaps becomes salvation. The fire has burned low, the hour has grown late, and the time has come for rest. I hope this tale has served you as it was intended, not to frighten or disturb your sleep, but rather to provide a narrative companion through these hours of night, a story to occupy your thoughts as they slow and soften, a gentle journey through mystery, resolved not with violence, but with understanding, with acceptance, with the acknowledgement that some puzzles teach us more through their essential mysteriousness than through any definitive solution. If you have found comfort in this narrative, if it has helped guide you towards sleep's peaceful realm, I invite you to subscribe to this channel, to like this video, to share it with others who seek gentle stories for nighttime listening. Your support allows more such tales to be created, more journeys into mystery and wonder to be undertaken together. And now, my friend, the time has come to release you to your dreams. May you sleep peacefully. May your rest be undisturbed. May you wake refreshed and renewed. May the mysteries you encounter in sleep be gentle ones, the puzzles inviting rather than troubling, the landscapes you traverse in dreams beautiful and strange and welcoming. Thank you for spending this evening with me, for allowing me to share this tale of Sherlock Holmes and the frozen lake, of sacrifice and pattern, of ancient places that remember and modern souls who seek to understand. Good night, dear listener. Good night.